So in our last video, we talked about the anatomy of arguments. We talked about what arguments are and what their parts are. We went over the concept of argument, proposition, premise, conclusion, and argument form. What I want to talk about now is some properties of arguments, namely validity, invalidity, soundness, and unsoundness. So let's start with the notions of validity and invalidity. And I want to say at the outset, so you're aware of this and you can increase your focus right now, these two concepts of validity, logical validity and invalidity, in my experience, have been the most difficult for students to really get down. So let's, from the beginning, try to get down clearly what each notion means. So let's start with a valid argument. So a valid argument, it's an argument with premises which, if true, would prove the truth of the conclusion. The premises don't have to actually be true, it just has to be the case that if the premises were true, it would prove the truth of the conclusion. So for examples of these, we can see arguments A and B above again. Those are both valid arguments. If it's the case that God is a perfect being, and it's the case that existence is a perfection, then it would have to be the case that God exists. If it was the case that evil is a thing, and it's the case that God is the source of all things, then it's going to be the case that God is the source of evil. And one of the most famous examples of a valid argument is here in argument C, which runs as follows. Number 1, Socrates is a man. 2, all men are mortal. 3, the conclusion, thus Socrates is mortal. So is it the case that Socrates is a man? Or perhaps more contentiously, is it the case that all men or all human beings are mortal? I don't freaking know. And you know what? It doesn't matter to know whether the argument is valid or not. All you need to know whether it's valid or not is whether, if those claims were true, the premises, would the conclusion be true? And it's the case that if Socrates is a man, and if all men are mortal, then Socrates would be mortal. Hence, that's a valid argument. Same thing with arguments at A and B, right? Maybe we don't know the actual truth value of the premises, whether they're true or false in the arguments A and B. But if they were true, then the conclusions of those arguments would be true, and that's why they're valid. That's why we say that they are valid or logically valid. That's what that notion means in logic. It may mean something different outside of philosophy or logic classes. You know, it may mean like that's a good point or something. But when we're talking about validity and invalidity in a philosophy class, we're asking whether or not the argument is such that if the premises were true, the conclusion would be true. And if the argument is such that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true, then it's a valid argument. Our next concept that we're going to discuss is an invalid argument. And an invalid argument is an argument where even if the premises were true, it wouldn't prove the truth of the conclusion. Another way to describe an invalid argument as an argument that could have true premises but a false conclusion. There's some disconnect between the premises and the conclusion such that even if the premises were true, it wouldn't prove the truth of the conclusion. So let's look at some examples of invalid arguments. So argument D, 2 + 2 = 4, thus God exists, right? Obviously there's some disconnect between the premises and the conclusion. It could be the case that 2 + 2 = 4, but the case that God did not exist, or it's at least it seems, right? It seems so. Maybe Augusta might have something to say that when we get there. But the point here is that I want you to see there's some jump. The conclusion does not follow cleanly from the premise as it does in the other arguments that we discussed. Here's another example of an invalid argument. Argument E. 1, my mom told me that God exists. 2, thus God exists, right? So it could be the case that whoever made this argument, their mom told them that God exists, but that doesn't seem to prove the truth of God existing now, does it? Right? So it could be the case that the premise was true and the conclusion false. If you want a real clear case of an invalid argument, how about this? Broccoli is a vegetable, therefore I'm Miss America. Right? Isn't that the best example of an invalid argument you've ever heard? The next concept we're going to talk about is what a sound argument is. A sound argument is an argument that is both valid and has true premises. If you say an argument's sound, that's the highest praise you can give it an argument. Essentially, it's like a proof of the conclusion. So here are some examples of a sound argument. Argument F, 2 plus 2 equals 4. 4 is half of 8. Thus, 2 plus 2 equals half of 8. So it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's true that 4 is half of 8, right? So there's true premises. And it's also the case that if 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 4 is half of 8, that 2 plus 2 is half of 8. So that's a sound argument. Now, I left the other example blank, so I want you to try to think up a sound argument. And I think you'll see it's hard to think up one that's not trivial. And most of what we're going to be discussing or thinking about in the class and debating on is whether or not these arguments we're going to consider concerning God are sound or not. And if an argument's not sound, well, guess what? It's an unsound argument. So what's an unsound argument? It's an argument that either has one or more false premises or that is invalid, or both, right? So let's look at some examples of unsound arguments. Okay, what about this one? Argument H, I like whales that wear bow ties, therefore God exists. Maybe it's a case that I like whales that wear bow ties. I actually do. But what the heck does that have to do with God existing, right? So this argument is unsound, not because it has a false premise, because like I said, I like whales that wear bow ties. But me liking whales that wear bow ties doesn't prove that God exists. So that argument is unsound because it's invalid. The reasoning's bad. Another example could be an argument I. Cows are carnivorous animals. All carnivorous animals are plants. Thus, cows are plants. So that argument is unsound. But why? Is it because it's invalid? Is it because the reasoning is bad? No, the reasoning is impeccable. That's a valid argument. If cows are carnivorous animals, and if all carnivorous animals are plants, then it would be true that cows are plants. The problem here is not the validity of the argument. The problem is that the premises are false. It's not the case that cows are carnivorous animals, and it's also not the case that carnivorous animals are plants. Right? So in the first example, we had an argument that was unsound because it had a invalid form. In the second example, we had an argument that was unsound, not because it had an invalid form, but because it had one or more false premises. And again, you could also have an argument that went wrong on both accounts, both being invalid and having one or more false premises. So in this video, we talked about various properties that an argument can have depending on its structure and its content. Namely, we talked about the notions of validity, invalidity, soundness, and unsoundness. Remember, an argument is valid when it's the case that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true. An argument's invalid when it's the case that even if the premises were true, the conclusion could still be false. A sound argument is an argument that has true premises and that's logically valid. An unsound argument is an argument that either has one or more false premises, is invalid, or both. In the next video, what we're going to do is discuss some related notions, namely the notions of assumptions, both implicit and explicit assumptions, and we're also going to talk about consistency between propositions, or consistent propositions and inconsistent propositions. I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.